The Galactic Conclave had seen 3,000 years of history walk through its chamber doors. Empires had risen and collapsed within those walls. Species had entered as conquerors and exited as footnotes. Wars had been declared here, ended here, quietly arranged here over the polite fiction of diplomatic language. The chamber itself was ancient in the way that only things built by civilizations with genuine patience could be ancient. Its curved walls rising 40 meters in smooth, living stone, that the conclave's founding species had grown rather than carved. Its air carrying the faint, layered scent of 1,000 different atmospheric requirements filtered into something breathable for all. The seats of the senior delegates were positioned at the center in a wide, tiered ring. Everything else, every lesser delegation, every observer, every newly admitted species making their first formal address, occupied the outer ring. The outer ring chairs were smaller. That was not an accident. On the morning that Earth's delegation entered the Galactic Conclave chamber for the first time, 63 years after humanity's first faster-than-light transit, and 11 months after their formal application for membership had been accepted, the senior delegates of 23 spacefaring civilizations gave them approximately the same quality of attention one gives to background noise. Humanity was, after all, Tier 4. The lowest classification the Conclave assigned, reserved for species new to interstellar travel, biologically non-threatening, militarily negligible, and unlikely to affect the existing power balance in any meaningful way for at least several generations. The Conclave had processed 14 Tier 4 admissions in the last century alone. They followed a predictable pattern. The new species arrived awed and grateful, delivered a speech full of hope and interstellar brotherhood, accepted their outer ring seat without complaint, and spent the next 50 years learning how things worked before anyone important paid attention to them. It was, the senior delegates agreed without needing to say it aloud, a manageable process. No one had reviewed Earth's historical files in any particular depth. Why would they? They were Tier 4. Xenodiplomacy officer Hannah had prepared her address for 4 months. Not because she was nervous. She had spent 15 years in diplomatic service and had long since made her peace with speaking in front of large, indifferent audiences. She had prepared carefully because she believed, with a precision that some of her colleagues found slightly unnerving, that words entered into an official record had consequences, and that the consequences of the words she was about to enter into the Galactic Conclave's permanent record deserved to be chosen with care. She stood at the address podium in the center of the chamber, a small figure in dark formal attire under the vast, curved ceiling, and she looked out at the assembled delegates of 23 civilizations, at the compound eyes and the layered scales and the bioluminescent frills, and all the varied, extraordinary expressions of life that had reached the stars before humanity. And she felt something that was not quite awe and not quite pride, and was perhaps simply the weight of the moment pressing itself into memory. She opened her prepared remarks. She did not begin with hope. She did not begin with brotherhood. She did not describe the wonder of standing in this chamber, or humanity's dreams of peaceful coexistence among the stars, or any of the things that the Conclave's reception staff had gently suggested in their pre-address briefing that new species typically emphasize to make a favorable first impression. She began with history. Members of the Conclave, she said, her voice carried cleanly through the chamber's translation matrices into 47 simultaneous languages. Earth thanks this body for its recognition of our civilization and welcomes the opportunity to address this assembly. Before we speak of our hopes for the future, we believe it is appropriate to speak plainly about our past. A few delegates shifted. That was not the usual opening. Humanity has existed in recognizable form for approximately 300,000 years, Hannah continued, her tone even and unhurried. We have spent the majority of that time in conflict with one another, not occasionally, not in isolated periods of instability, continuously, persistently, and with a creativity in the development of destructive capability that has no parallel we have yet discovered in our study of other species' histories. The translation matrices hummed. In the tiered senior seats, several delegates exchanged glances. We have fought wars over territory, over resources, over ideology, over religion, over succession, over trade, over wounds real and imagined, over pride, and on at least 3 documented occasions, over agricultural disputes that modern historians still find difficult to fully explain. We have developed, refined, and rebuilt our weapons technology in every generation without exception, not because any external force required us to, but because the internal pressures of our own civilization demanded it. She paused, not for effect, because she wanted the translation matrices to catch up before she continued. We tell you this not as confession, and not as warning of aggressive intent toward this body or any of its members. We tell you this because we believe you deserve an accurate picture of what humanity is, rather than a comfortable one. We are not, in our own assessment, a violent species by preference. We are a species that has spent 300,000 years becoming very, very good at violence by necessity, and that distinction matters. The chamber was quieter now, not attentive exactly, but quieter. We ask only to exist here as we have asked to exist at every table we have ever sat at in good faith, with patience, and in peace. Hana's voice did not change. It remained level and clear and precise. We are patient people. We have always been patient people. But if you move against us, if any power in this galaxy chooses to test the distinction between what we prefer and what we are capable of, understand this. She looked across the chamber, at all of it, all of them. We do not stop, we have never stopped. That is not a threat, it is simply history, and it is now in your record. She stepped back from the podium. For exactly 2 seconds, the chamber was silent. Then the noise began, the overlapping frequencies of 24 species expressing amusement in their own particular ways. Clicks and harmonics and subsonic vibrations, and one delegate from a gas giant species that communicated in pressure differentials whose laughter registered on the chamber's atmospheric sensors as a brief, inexplicable change in air density. The conclave's senior protocol officer later noted in his personal log that it was the most uniformly amused response to a new species address he had witnessed in 40 years of service. A Tier 4 species, warning the galaxy based on a history of fighting each other. The senior delegate of the Vreth Dominion, a broad-shouldered reptilian figure in the inner ring whose species had held 11 star systems for 6 centuries, made a sound that his translator rendered charitably as polite skepticism. His aide leaned over and said something. He responded briefly. The exchange was not transmitted on any official channel, but a conclave staff member nearby caught it and repeated it later. The aide had said, "Should we update our assessment of the humans?" The senior delegate had said, "Update it to what? They fight among themselves like primitive animals and call it a qualification, note it for amusement and move on." He looked away from Earth's outer ring seat before Hana had even returned to her chair. Somewhere in the conclave's vast administrative infrastructure, the address was processed, time-stamped, translated, and filed into the permanent record under Earth's civilization entry. It sat there, precisely logged, exactly where Hana had intended it to be. No one read it twice. Intelligence analyst Rena had not attended the address ceremony. She was, at that moment, in a windowless room in Earth's Interstellar Defense Intelligence Division, sitting in front of a wall of screens with 3 cold cups of tea and a report she had been building for 6 weeks. The report concerned the Vreth Dominion. Specifically, it concerned a pattern of survey drone activity she had detected along the outer edges of the Kepler belt, the region of space where Earth's 17 colonial settlements were concentrated. That did not match any registered conclave survey or trade operation. Someone was mapping the Kepler colonies, systematically, carefully, the kind of mapping you did when you were planning something you hadn't announced yet. Rena had spent 6 weeks confirming the data from every angle she could access before she was willing to put her name on it. She was not a person who filed reports she wasn't certain of. She was also not a person given to dramatic conclusions. But the data said what the data said, and the data said that the Vreth Dominion was conducting unauthorized tactical surveys of human colonial infrastructure. She titled the report clearly. She attached all supporting sensor data. She filed it through the appropriate channels to the Conclave's Joint Intelligence Oversight Board, which was the correct procedure for cross-species intelligence concerns under Article 12 of the Conclave Charter. The Oversight Board acknowledged receipt. 3 days later, she received a reply informing her that the report had been reviewed and determined to fall below the threshold for formal investigation, as the survey patterns identified were consistent with routine deep space navigation recalibration activities common to Vreth vessels in that region. Rena read the reply twice. She looked at her data, at the patterns, at the 6 weeks of careful, methodical confirmation. Then she picked up her secure line and called Admiral Junho directly, bypassing the Oversight Board and every formal channel between her and him, which was technically outside her authority, and which she did without a moment's hesitation. Junho answered on the second ring. She told him what the data showed. She told him what the Oversight Board had decided. She told him, with the flat, precise delivery of someone reporting observable facts, that in her professional assessment, the Conclave's review had been either negligent or deliberately indifferent, and that either way the conclusion was identical. No one was going to do anything about it. Junho was quiet for a moment. "Send me everything," he said, "all of it, direct to my personal terminal." "Already sent," she said. "Junho." "I heard you, Rena." A pause. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. She heard, in the silence, the specific quality of thought, the sound of a mind moving through options and outcomes with the methodical speed of someone who had spent decades practicing exactly that process. "What I should have been doing already," he said, quietly. He ended the call. Admiral Junho did not make announcements. He did not call press conferences. He did not submit formal mobilization requests that would have required conclave notification under the joint security protocols that Earth, as a new member, was technically obligated to follow for any military movement exceeding a certain scale. He did not, in any documentable, traceable, officially visible way, do anything at all. What he did, quietly, carefully, over the following weeks, through channels that existed specifically, because someone had once had the foresight to build channels that didn't appear in standard conclave oversight reports, was begin moving pieces. Reserve units, recalled under the cover of routine training rotations. Supply chains, redirected through civilian contractors whose logistics manifests didn't trigger conclave monitoring thresholds. Weapons engineer Tiho reached through a private frequency that Junho had maintained for exactly this kind of contingency, briefed in a conversation that lasted 40 minutes and ended with Tiho saying, in his unhurried way, "I'll need access to the Project Ember archives." Full access. Junho gave it. He also, through back channels he had spent 30 years cultivating, ensured that Kangho's ground divisions were positioned, quietly, without fanfare, under the standing justification of colonial defense exercises, closer to the Kepler belt than they had been before. The Galactic Conclave's monitoring systems noted none of it. They were not watching. Why would they watch a Tier 4? In the Conclave's outer ring, Earth's small chair sat precisely where protocol required it to sit. Hana attended every session. She listened to every debate. She studied the faces of the senior delegates, the ones who had laughed, the ones who had looked away, the ones who had not looked up at all, with the quiet, methodical attention she brought to everything. She was building a map, not of space, of people, of who could be trusted and who couldn't, of who paid attention and who performed attention, of which civilizations in this chamber would matter and which ones would simply be present when things changed. She already knew things were going to change. She had known it in the chamber on the day she delivered her address, when she had watched the Vreth delegate look away before she had finished speaking. She had not expected to be right so quickly. She had hoped, With the part of herself she kept quiet and separate from her professional assessments, that she would be wrong entirely. She filed that hope away with other things she didn't have time for, and she went to work. Outside the conclave's ancient walls, the Kepler belt turned in the dark. 17 colonies, 400 million people, going about their days in the good faith assumption that the galaxy was, at minimum, indifferent to their existence. The survey drones were still running their patterns. Nobody official was watching them. But Rena was watching, and Rena had told Junho, and Junho was already moving pieces in the dark, with the patient, unhurried certainty of a man who had read enough history to know that warnings, once given and ignored, have a way of becoming prophecy. The warning was in the record. It had always been in the record. What came next was simply the consequence of not reading it. The first colony to go dark was Kepler 9 Outpost Murray. It happened at 3:47 local station time, when most of its 22,000 residents were asleep. There was no ultimatum, no hail, no warning shot fired across the bow as a formal gesture of hostility, the way the Vreth Dominion typically handled acquisitions of worthy opponents. For a Tier 4 species, they simply came in and took what they wanted. The Vreth battle cruisers dropped out of faster-than-light transit at the edge of the Kepler belt in a coordinated three-pronged formation. Murray, then Kepler 14 settlement Dory, then the civilian transit hub at Kepler 22 station Buell, 3 targets, 3 simultaneous strikes. The entire operation had been war-gamed in Vreth command for less than a week, because anything more would have been an insult to their own efficiency. You didn't spend months planning to step on an insect. It took them 40 minutes to bring all 3 locations under occupation. Emergency Broadcast Officer Sona was on shift at Deep Space Station Orion when the first distress signal crackled through on the civilian emergency frequency. She was 26 years old, 4 months into her posting, and she had spent most of her quiet night shifts learning to play a small stringed instrument she'd brought from home. She set it down slowly when she heard Murray's automated distress beacon begin broadcasting. She cross-checked the signal, then checked it again, then pulled the visual feeds from the relay satellites positioned along the Kepler belt's outer rim, and stared for a full 3 seconds at the shape of Vreth warships she had only ever seen in recognition manuals. Sona did not scream. She did not freeze. She opened every broadcast channel available to Orion Station, civilian, military, conclave registered, and the 2 private relay networks that Earth technically wasn't supposed to use, and she began transmitting. Her voice was steady. "This is Emergency Broadcast Officer Sona at Deep Space Station Orion, broadcasting on all available frequencies. Kepler 9, Kepler 14, and Kepler 22 are under active Vreth Dominion military assault. Civilian casualties are unconfirmed but presumed severe. This is not a drill. I am transmitting full sensor logs, visual confirmation, and fleet composition data on this frequency. I am transmitting continuously until..." The station shuddered. The lights cut to emergency red. Sona kept talking. She was still transmitting when Orion Station's hull was breached. The last 18 seconds of her broadcast were background noise, the hiss of escaping atmosphere, a distant, metallic groan, and then silence. The signal reached Earth 17 hours later. Intelligence analyst Rena heard it first. She was already awake. She was almost always already awake, sitting in the windowless lower sublevel of Earth's Interstellar Defense Intelligence Division with 3 cold cups of tea and a wall of screens that never went dark. She had been watching the Kepler belt sensor grid with increasing unease for 11 days, ever since a patrol drone had returned with anomalous transit readings she couldn't explain away. When Sona's broadcast came through, Rena listened to all of it, including the last 18 seconds. Then she sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up her secure line and called Admiral Junho. He answered on the second ring. She didn't bother with preamble. They hit the Kepler colonies, 3 sites, simultaneous. A pause on the line. Not surprised, Junho had read her original report, the one that had been shelved. The pause was something else. Something that sounded, to Rena's ear, like a man setting something down very carefully before picking up something heavier. Casualties. Unknown. Sona got a full sensor log out before Orion went dark. I'm cross-referencing now. Junho, she hesitated, which she almost never did. Orion's gone. She was still broadcasting. Another pause, longer this time. Send everything to my terminal, all of it, and Rena. Already forwarding Tiho's contact file to your secondary line, she said quietly. I assumed. Good, a breath, wake everyone up. The signal reached the public 17 hours after it left Orion Station. It didn't matter that it was the middle of the night in half the world. It didn't matter that most civilian networks had a 40-minute delay on unverified emergency broadcasts. Someone leaked it. No one ever found out who, and within 2 hours, Sona's voice was playing on every screen on Earth. People watched in silence. In living rooms, in diners, in hospital waiting areas, in university dormitories where students gathered around a single screen and didn't speak. Parents held their children without quite knowing why they reached for them. Old veterans sat down heavily in whatever chair was nearest. Then the silence ended. There was no coordinated response. No government directive sent out to shape public sentiment. No carefully managed press conference with measured statements about ongoing diplomatic assessment. The sentiment that swept the planet in the following 6 hours was not manufactured, and it was not performed, and it could not have been stopped by anything short of turning off the sun. It was, in every language spoken on Earth, the same thing. Parliament after parliament convened in emergency session. Vote after vote came back identical. Rena, monitoring the feeds from her sub-level office, watched the tally roll across her screen and felt something cold and certain settle in her chest. There was no word for what she was watching that was quite accurate in any language. It was not rage exactly, and it was not grief exactly, and it was not patriotism in any clean sense. It was something older than all of those things. It was the specific, terrible unity of a species that had spent thousands of years learning how to close ranks. She flagged the vote tallies, attached them to her operational brief, and wrote a single line at the top. Unanimous, proceed at discretion. Secretary General Yuna made the formal announcement at dawn, Earth Standard Time. She stood at the podium with the kind of stillness that takes years to develop, the stillness of someone who had decided, fully and without reservation, what needed to be done, and was no longer spending any energy on doubt. She said what needed to be said. She said it without theater. The Vreth Dominion had attacked 3 human settlements. They had killed civilians. They had destroyed an emergency broadcast station where one of Earth's own officers had stayed at her post and kept transmitting until there was no air left to breathe. Earth's response would be proportional, she said. Proportional to what humanity was, not to what the Vreth Dominion had assumed humanity was. She did not raise her voice once. She did not need to. Admiral Junho didn't watch the announcement. He was already in the command center, already in uniform, already 3 hours into the most important mobilization briefing of his career. The room was full of senior officers who had been pulled from beds and dinners and leave rotations, and every one of them had the same expression, the specific, focused calm of professionals who had trained for something they hoped would never come and were now doing it. He pulled up the galactic map, the Kepler belt, the 3 dark markers where the colony signals had gone silent, the projected Vreth supply lines, and the likely reinforcement corridors they would use to consolidate their occupation. Project Ember, he said, without looking up from the map. Status. His aide answered immediately. Tiho is already en route, sir. He says the first network arrays can be operational in the Kepler belt within 19 days. Tell him 17, Junho said. Sir, he said 19 was already. Tell him 17. His aide made a note. She did not argue. Nobody in that room argued. Junho looked at the map for a long moment, at the small, spread-out scatter of human colonies, at the vast dark between them and the Vreth Dominion's 11 systems, at the thin, fragile lines of the shipping routes Rena had flagged 11 days ago, when it might still have been possible to prevent this. It had not been prevented. That was finished now. The time for preventing things was over. He looked up at his officers. "They thought we were prey," he said simply. "Let's show them what we've been doing with the last 40 years." The room was silent for exactly 1 second. Then everyone got to work. Across the galaxy, in the vaulted debating chambers of the Galactic Conclave, the emergency session was called to order. Species delegates representing 23 civilizations debated in overlapping frequencies about measured responses and diplomatic channels, and the unfortunate but understandable strategic interests of the Vreth Dominion. Xenodiplomacy Officer Hana sat in Earth's assigned seat, a small chair at the outer ring of the chamber, as befitted a Tier 4 delegation, and listened to every word. Her expression gave nothing away. She already knew that none of it mattered. She had heard Sona's broadcast too. She had heard the last 18 seconds. She had watched the vote tallies come in from every parliament on Earth, one after another, unanimous as falling dominoes. She knew what was already moving in the dark of the Kepler belt. She knew what Tiho was doing right now in a military transport traveling at maximum speed toward the outer colonies. She knew what Rena was building, what Junho was planning, what Kangho was positioning. The conclave was still debating. Hana waited for the chair to recognize her. When it did, she stood, smoothed her jacket, and invoked Article 7 of the Conclave Charter in a clear, formal voice. Earth's right to self-defense entered into the official record. It was acknowledged, it was noted, it was tabled for further review. Hana sat down. She looked at the great curved ceiling of the chamber, at the thousands of years of galactic political history embedded in its architecture, and she thought of Sona, 26 years old, still transmitting until the end, and of the 400 million people living in the Kepler colonies who had woken up to warships in their sky. She thought of Junho's voice on the secure line that morning, when she had called to tell him about the conclave's response. He hadn't said much. He had simply said, "Then we do it ourselves." She folded her hands in her lap. Around her, the conclave kept debating. It didn't matter. The thing that was coming wasn't going to wait for a committee. The Vreth called the Operation Consolidation Phase 2. It was not a dramatic name. It was not meant to be. Drama was for enemies you respected, for campaigns against civilizations that had earned the vocabulary of war, the formal declarations, the named offensives, the titles that would later be carved into the stone of military history. This was not that. This was administration. The Kepler belt colonies had been secured in 40 minutes. Phase 2 was simply the logistical follow-through. Move in the secondary fleet. Establish permanent garrison infrastructure, begin the resource extraction surveys, and process the human population into whatever category of compliance the Dominion's colonial administration deemed most efficient. The secondary fleet was commanded by Sub-Admiral Vrethkas, a 17-year veteran of 4 previous consolidation campaigns, none of which had involved anything he would have described as meaningful resistance. He had been chosen for this assignment specifically because of that record: efficiency, clean results, minimal complication. He reviewed the tactical briefing on humanity one final time before transit. 63 years of interstellar travel. Drive technology 2 generations behind current conclave standard. No documented fleet engagements against any external power. Military capacity listed in the conclave database as theoretical, unverified by direct observation, which was the classification they used for species, so new that no one had bothered to make them prove it yet. Vrethkas closed the briefing. He told his navigation officer to take them in. The Kepler belt looked, on long-range sensors, exactly as it should. Asteroid fields, dust concentrations, the gravitational signature of the colonial settlements, still broadcasting on emergency frequencies, which was expected, humans making noise, as they apparently did, and the quiet, cold drift of deep space between the rocks. Nothing unusual. Nothing that flagged on any of his fleet's scanning systems. Nothing that looked like anything other than what it was. A mineral-rich belt in the outer territory of a minor civilization, recently acquired, awaiting administration. Vrethkos ordered the fleet into standard consolidation formation and moved them into the belt at three-quarter transit speed. He was thinking at that precise moment about the paperwork. There was always paperwork after a consolidation. Procurement requests for garrison materials, personnel assignment forms, the initial resource survey documentation that the Dominion's Colonial Bureau required in triplicate. He had developed over 17 years a system for handling it efficiently. He was running through that system in his mind as his fleet passed the outer marker buoys and entered the inner belt. He was still thinking about it when the first mine detonated. Field Commander Kangho had been in the Kepler belt for 19 days. He had moved the Europa Division in through the same back-channel logistics network that Junho had been quietly building since Rina's call, civilian transport manifests, broken into small enough groups to avoid triggering conclave monitoring thresholds, reassembled inside the belt at a staging point, tucked inside a dense asteroid cluster that Rina had identified as a sensor shadow 3 weeks before the first colony went dark. 19 days, living in the asteroids, eating ration packs, running systems checks on equipment that needed to be ready the moment it was called upon, in conditions that would have been described in any standard military doctrine as deeply unpleasant. Kangho's people did not complain. He had selected them specifically for their relationship with deeply unpleasant conditions. The Europa Division trained in Europa's subsurface ocean tunnels, zero visibility, crushing pressure, temperatures that made most military equipment unreliable. They were not people who needed comfort to function. They were people who had been trained, systematically and deliberately, to function in the absence of it. He had spent those 19 days doing 2 things. The first was placing the mass driver mines, thousands of them, precisely positioned across every viable approach vector into the inner belt, threaded between asteroids with the care of a person who understood that the difference between a mine that worked and a mine that didn't was usually a matter of centimeters and patience. Kangho had both in abundance. The second was waiting. He was good at waiting. He had always been good at waiting. He had learned it, as most soldiers learn the things that keep them alive, from the specific experience of being in a situation where waiting was the only correct action, and the cost of impatience was final. He waited. When Rina's alert came through on his secured channel, fleet entered outer belt, 17 minutes to inner marker. He set down the technical manual he'd been reviewing and looked at his senior officers, assembled in the cramped forward compartment of the division's command vessel. He said positions. That was all. Everyone moved. Weapons engineer Tiho was not in the Kepler belt. He was aboard a fast courier vessel positioned just outside the belt's outer boundary, far enough from the engagement zone to be safe, close enough to monitor the Ember network's performance data in real time. He had insisted on this positioning over the objections of the logistics team, who had pointed out reasonably that there was no tactical necessity for him to be anywhere near the engagement. Tiho had explained, with the patient precision of a man who had spent 31 years on a project and was not going to trust its first live deployment to a remote feed, that he would be monitoring from close range, or he would be monitoring from somewhere else, and they could run the network without him. They had given him the courier vessel. He sat now in its small operations bay, surrounded by screens showing the Ember network status across the entire inner belt, 412 individual torpedo units, arranged in 19 interlocking grid patterns, each one currently running in silent standby mode, emitting nothing, saying nothing, sitting in the dark between the asteroids with the particular, absolute patience of machines built by someone who understood patience as an engineering principle. He watched the Vreth fleet's approach on the passive sensor feed. 31 ships, standard consolidation configuration, moving at three-quarter transit speed, which told him they weren't expecting contact. If they'd been expecting contact, they would have come in slower, with weapons hot and shields at full extension. They were coming in the way you moved through a neighborhood you'd already decided was yours, with the particular, comfortable carelessness of ownership. Tiho watched them cross the outer marker. He watched them enter the minefield's outer perimeter. He made one adjustment to the Ember network's targeting parameters, a minor recalibration he had identified 3 days ago and had been waiting for a live sensor environment to confirm. And then he put his hands flat on the console and watched. The first mine detonated at the lead ship's port bow. Not a catastrophic strike. The mass driver mines were positioned for disruption, not immediate destruction. They were there to do one specific thing: break the fleet's formation, scatter them, push individual ships out of their consolidated grouping and into the spaces between the asteroids where the Ember network was waiting. Vreth Kas responded exactly as Kangho had predicted he would, exactly as any competent commander would respond to an unexpected contact in a confined space. He ordered immediate formation tightening, shields to full, and a speed reduction to give his navigators time to assess the threat environment. Formation tightening meant his ships moved closer together. Moving closer together meant they moved into the specific corridors between the asteroid clusters that the mine pattern had been designed to funnel them into. The Ember network received the updated position data from the passive sensors. Across 412 torpedo units, the targeting geometry updated simultaneously, each unit adjusting its approach vector in the smooth, continuous, unhurried way that Tiho had spent 3 decades engineering. They did not hurry. They did not need to hurry. They were already exactly where they needed to be. They had been there for 19 days. Vreth Kas had 11 seconds between the first mine detonation and the moment his threat assessment system registered the Ember torpedoes. 11 seconds during which his crew was doing exactly what they were trained to do: shields up, weapons hot, damage reports coming in from the port bow, navigation pulling up the asteroid field charts, communications requesting status from the fleet's other vessels. 11 seconds of professional, competent crisis response. His threat system flagged the torpedoes at second 8, flagged them not as incoming weapons fire, because they registered on no known weapons frequency, emitted no recognizable energy signature, appeared on his sensors as nothing more than slightly irregular mass concentrations moving through the asteroid debris, but as anomalous contacts. Unknown classification. Recommend evasive assessment. He had 3 seconds to decide what that meant. He did not have enough context to decide correctly in 3 seconds. No one would have. The Ember systems had been specifically designed so that no one would. At second 11, Tiho activated the network. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. Later, when the tactical data was recovered and reviewed by conclave military analysts who would spend months trying to reconstruct exactly what had happened in the Kepler belt that day, the 11-minute figure would be the one that appeared in every report, every briefing, every classified assessment circulated through every major power's intelligence service. 11 minutes. 31 ships. The analysts would note, with the specific discomfort of professionals confronting something that didn't fit their existing frameworks, that the Ember network had not simply destroyed the Vreth fleet. It had done so with a systematic, sequential efficiency that suggested not a weapons system responding to targets, but something closer to a problem being solved, each detonation creating conditions that informed the next. The network learning from its own engagement in real time, adapting, adjusting, closing options with the steady, patient logic of a proof working toward its conclusion. One analyst wrote, in a personal note that was not included in the official report, but was later recovered and widely circulated. It felt deliberate in a way that weapons fire usually doesn't, like it wasn't in a hurry because it already knew how it was going to end. Tiho, reading that note much later, considered it the most accurate description of his life's work he had ever encountered from an outside observer. He did not say this to anyone. He simply noted it in his personal engineering log and went back to work. 3 ships escaped the initial engagement. Vreth Kos was not aboard any of them. His flagship had been one of the first to go caught in the second wave of Ember detonations before his crew had finished processing what the first wave was. He had not suffered. Tiho's systems did not leave time for that. The 3 surviving vessels broke from the belt at maximum transit speed on diverging vectors, which was the standard emergency dispersal protocol for a fleet that had suffered catastrophic losses. Spread out, make pursuit harder, get a message out before anything else. They were fast. Pilot Diho and the 9th Ghost Squadron were faster. Diho had been holding position at the belt's outer edge for 11 days. He was 29 years old and had been flying since he was 17, and had spent the last 4 years in the Ghost Squadron, which was the designation given to the small, fast, extraordinarily difficult-to-detect interceptor units that Earth's military had developed specifically for pursuit and denial operations. Ghost Squadron fighters were not built for fleet engagements. They were built for exactly this, running down things that were trying to run. He watched the 3 Vreth vessels break from the belt on his tactical display. He watched their vectors. He did the geometry in his head, the way he had been doing geometry since flight school, the way it had become reflex rather than calculation. He opened the squadron channel. Ghost Flight, I have 3 contacts, bearing, he gave the vectors. We are not letting them get a clean transmission out. Stay with me. His people said nothing. They didn't need to. They were already moving. The Ghost Squadron's fighters were small enough and fast enough, and built to emit a sensor profile close enough to natural cosmic debris, that the Vreth vessel's automated threat systems didn't flag them, until the squadron was already within engagement range. By then, it was a matter of closure rates and angles, and Diho had spent 4 years making sure those calculations always came out in his favor. He caught the first vessel at the outer marker. The second, 7 minutes later, trying a course correction that might have worked against a less experienced pursuit pilot. The third was the hardest. Its commander was good, using the belt's outer asteroid scatter as cover, pushing the ship's drive beyond safe tolerance in a way that Diho recognized as genuine desperation. He respected it, he noted it. He closed anyway. The third vessel managed, in its final moments, to get a partial transmission out. Diho's sensors caught it broadcasting on conclave emergency frequencies. A burst transmission, compressed, already on its way across the light years by the time he completed the engagement. He pulled his fighter around and checked the transmission's content on the recovery feed. It was 4 words. 4 words, translated across the conclave's emergency channels into 47 languages simultaneously, arriving in the grand chamber of the Galactic Conclave during a routine session debate on agricultural trade rights, flashing across the screen of every delegate's terminal in the precise, clean typography of the emergency broadcast system. They were already waiting. Diho sat in his cockpit for a moment after he confirmed the third contact was down. Outside his viewport, the Kepler belt turned in the dark, the asteroids and the dust and the cold, deep quiet of space that had been, for the last 11 days, home. He could see, on his long-range sensors, the debris field spreading from the engagement zone, the slow, silent drift of what had been 31 ships. He thought about the colonies, about the 400 million people living in the Kepler belt who had woken up 2 weeks ago to Vreth warships in their sky, about Sona, 26 years old, still transmitting until the end. He didn't feel triumphant. He had been in the Ghost Squadron long enough to know what he felt, which was the specific, quiet gravity of having done a necessary thing that he wished had not been necessary. It was not the same as regret. It was not the same as satisfaction. It was something in between that had no clean name and that he had learned, over 4 years, to simply carry without requiring it to resolve into something simpler. He opened the squadron channel. Ghost flight confirmed status. One by one, his people checked in. All present, he let out a breath he hadn't been aware of holding. "Form up," he said. "We're going home." In the Galactic Conclave's grand chamber, the forward transmission hung on every delegate's screen for a long, suspended moment. They were already waiting. The routine session debate on agricultural trade rights had stopped entirely. The chamber was quiet in the way it only went quiet when something had happened that no one had prepared a response for, the specific, heavy silence of a room full of people recalibrating simultaneously. The senior delegate of a mid-tier civilization spoke first, directing his words to no one in particular. How large was the Vreth secondary fleet? His aide checked. 31 vessels, sir, full consolidation configuration. And the humans' response force? His aide checked again. It took longer this time, because the answer required pulling sensor data that had just come in, compressing 11 minutes of engagement telemetry into a readable summary, and then reading it twice to make sure the numbers were correct. "We're still assessing, sir," the aide said carefully, "but the initial reading suggests," he paused, "mines and an unknown weapons network, prepositioned, sir." "Prepositioned?" "Yes, sir, before the attack on the colonies." The chamber stayed quiet. Somewhere in that silence, at terminals across 23 delegations, analysts began pulling files. Earth files, historical records, military archives, documents that had been sitting in the Conclave's database since Earth's membership application, unread, unreviewed, categorized under the heading that now felt, to everyone reaching for it simultaneously, like the most expensive administrative oversight in Conclave history. Tier 4, non-threatening, militarily negligible. The Vreth Dominion's senior delegate seat was empty. Its occupant was, at that moment, debris in the Kepler belt. No one filled the seat. No one was ready to yet. Aboard his command ship at the edge of the Kepler belt, Admiral Junho received Kangho's confirmation report, Tiho's network performance summary, and Diho's squadron status update within 4 minutes of each other. He read all three. He looked at the tactical display for a moment, at the belt, at the engagement zone, at the positions of his own assets, still exactly where he had placed them. He looked at the Conclave's emergency channel feed, at the forward transmission still cycling through on the broadcast system. He thought of Rena's report, filed through the correct channels, reviewed and shelved by an oversight board that had decided it fell below the threshold for formal investigation. He thought of Hana, sitting in the outer ring of the conclave chamber in a chair that was smaller than the ones in the center, because that was where Tier 4 civilization sat. He thought of Sona. He closed the transmission feed. "Navigation," he said. "Sir." "Plot a course for Vreth space." A pause, not hesitation. His navigation officer was not someone who hesitated. Just the brief, professional interval of a person confirming they had heard correctly before proceeding. "I serve Vreth space, standing by." Junho looked at the display one last time. "Take us in," he said. The Vreth Dominion had 11 star systems. They had held them for 600 years, conquered, consolidated, and ruled with the kind of absolute confidence that comes from never having lost anything important. They had absorbed 4 minor civilizations in that time, dismantled 2 more, and frightened a dozen others into voluntary tribute without ever firing a single shot. They were, by every conclave metric that mattered, a major power. They had been watching humanity for less than 3 years. They had decided in that time that the Kepler belt colonies were worth taking, rich in minerals, strategically positioned, and defended by a species so new to the stars that their most advanced warships still used drive technology the Vreth had considered obsolete before humanity had discovered writing. It had seemed so simple. It had taken humanity 11 minutes to destroy their secondary fleet. Now, in the high command chambers of the Vreth homeworld, there was no longer any discussion of acquisition. There was only the question, asked in increasingly desperate tones by increasingly pale-scaled commanders, of what exactly was coming toward them through the dark, and how fast. The answer, delivered by their remaining long-range sensor arrays in clipped, mechanical tones, was faster than expected. Admiral Junho did not cross into Vreth space with ceremony. There was no fleet-wide broadcast, no speech delivered over the ship intercom about justice and humanity's fallen and the price of provocation. Those things happened in stories. In reality, what happened was that Junho reviewed the tactical overlay one final time, confirmed that all 17 Ember torpedo network arrays were active and slave to fleet command, noted that Tiho had somehow, impossibly, delivered the last 2 arrays 4 hours ahead of the revised 17-day schedule, and gave a single order to his navigation officer. "Take us in." The fleet crossed the border at 600 hours. There was no fanfare. There was no declaration of war transmitted to the Vreth High Command. Junho had considered it and decided against it, because declarations of war were, in his assessment, a courtesy extended to opponents who had extended courtesy first. The Vreth had not hailed Kepler 9 before reducing it. They had not issued an ultimatum before going dark on Orion Station. He saw no reason to be more generous than they had been. The first target was the Vreth Third Fleet anchorage at the edge of the Dominion's outer system, a vast installation that could service and rearm 40 warships simultaneously, and which the Vreth had considered safely positioned behind 3 layers of defensive perimeter. The Ember torpedoes moved through all 3 layers without triggering a single alarm. Weapons engineer Tiho had spent 31 years on Project Ember. He was 63 years old, slightly hard of hearing in his left ear from a long-ago lab accident, and possessed of the singular, unhurried focus of a man who had always known, with quiet certainty, that his work would eventually be needed. He had designed the Ember systems around one core principle, drawn from the oldest lesson in Earth's military history. Your weapon is only as good as your enemy's ability to see it coming. So he had built weapons that could not be seen coming. The Ember torpedoes emitted no recognizable energy signature, because Tiho had specifically studied the scanning frequencies used by every known conclave species, including the Vreth, and engineered his systems to exist in the gaps between them. They did not move in straight lines, because straight lines were predictable. They moved in patterns derived from fluid dynamics models, irregular and organic, the way water moves around an obstacle, the way a hunting animal moves through undergrowth. And they learned. Each torpedo in a network shared targeting data with every other torpedo in real time, adjusting, adapting, solving the geometry of the problem continuously until the moment of detonation. Tiho had described them once in a classified briefing as patient. He had meant it as a technical descriptor. It was also, in the most literal sense, accurate. The Third Fleet anchorage had been one of the largest military installations in Vreth space. When the dust cleared, it was a debris field spreading across 40,000 kilometers of empty space, and the only reason Junho knew it had been a military installation was because his sensors said so. There was nothing left that looked like one. Tiho, aboard the command ship, received the confirmation report. He made a note in his engineering log. He drank his tea. The Vreth rallied because they were not, whatever else they were, cowards. They scrambled their remaining fleet assets and concentrated them at Vreth Prime's outer orbital ring, defense platforms, warships, everything they had left, and they prepared to make humanity pay for crossing their border. Field Commander Kangho was already past the orbital ring. He had taken the ground divisions through a different approach vector, one that the Vreth Orbital Defense Network did not cover, because no one had ever attacked from that direction before, because it required coming in through a dense debris field from an ancient collision event that every competent navigator in the Dominion avoided as a matter of course. Kangho's navigators were not concerned with course, they were concerned with outcome. The Europa Division had trained for close-quarters planetary assault, in conditions that most species military planners would have classified as unsurvivable. Kang Ho had trained them there deliberately, because he had read enough history to know that unsurvivable conditions had a way of becoming survivable once you'd practiced them enough times. His forces reached the three Vreth military command centers on the surface before the orbital defense platforms had finished repositioning to deal with Junho's fleet. By the time the Vreth High Command realized they were fighting a battle on two entirely separate axes simultaneously, Kang Ho had already secured two of the three centers and was in the process of explaining, in formal, translated, professionally courteous terms, that the third had the option of a structured surrender or the same outcome as the first two. The third center chose surrender. Kang Ho logged the time, confirmed with Junho that the orbital platforms were now without ground-level command authority, and submitted his action report in the same calm, procedural tone he used for everything. The report was 4 sentences long. Junho read it and allowed himself a very small, very brief expression that was almost a smile. Two of the Dominion's minor allied powers, the Sethkai Collective and the Juran Assembly, had answered the Vreth's call for military support. They had committed to it before the Battle of the Kepler Belt. They had recommitted after the first Ember torpedo strikes, because backing down from a commitment was a significant political liability in conclave power dynamics, and because they had genuinely believed at the time that the Vreth were capable of turning this around. By the time their combined fleets reached the edge of Vreth space, they received 2 pieces of information in rapid succession. The first was a status report from Vreth High Command. It was very short. The second was a communication from Kang Ho's ground division, transmitted in the Sethkai Collective's own language by one of his xenolinguistics officers, informing them that Field Commander Kang Ho extended his professional regards and invited them to consider their current position carefully before proceeding further. The Sethkai Collective halted. The Juran Assembly halted. They looked at the sensor data from inside Vreth space. They looked at the Ember torpedo network signatures, now fully visible on the tactical overlay because Junho had, at this point, no reason to keep them hidden. They looked at the debris field where the 3rd Fleet anchorage had been. The Sethkai Collective requested a ceasefire communication channel within 40 minutes. The Juran Assembly requested 112 minutes after that. Kang Ho forwarded both requests to Junho with a note. "Recommend acceptance, sir. No strategic value in continuing against either." Junho agreed. The ceasefires were granted. Both powers began the political process of quietly pretending they had never been especially committed to the Vreth cause in the first place. In the Galactic Conclave's Grand Chamber, the session had been running for 16 consecutive hours. Species delegates debated with increasing urgency and decreasing composure about the situation unfolding in Vreth space. Words like disproportionate and destabilizing featured heavily. Several delegates expressed genuine concern about the precedent being set. Others expressed concern about what humanity's evident military capability meant for the Conclave's existing power structures. A few expressed concern about both things simultaneously, which made their contributions somewhat difficult to parse. Xenodiplomacy Officer Hana had been sitting in Earth's assigned seat for the entire 16 hours. She had not spoken. She had not moved much. She had eaten, at some point, a small meal brought to her by an aide, and she had drunk several cups of water, and she had listened to every word spoken in that chamber with the patient, unreadable attention of someone who was not surprised by any of it. When the chair finally recognized her, more out of procedural obligation than genuine desire to hear from the representative of a species currently dismantling a major power on the other side of the galaxy, she stood. She stood the way she always stood, straight, unhurried, like someone who had already decided what she was going to say before she walked into the room. "Members of the conclave," she said, and the chamber quieted because something in her voice made it quiet. "You are debating proportionality. You are debating precedent. You are debating what this conflict means for the stability of this body and the balance of power in this region of space." She paused, not for effect, because she wanted to make sure what came next was heard clearly. "On the day Earth joined this body, I stood in this chamber and I read into the official record a statement about what humanity is and what humanity does when it is harmed. You have that record. Every one of you has access to it. I will not repeat it today. What I will tell you is this." Her eyes moved across the chamber, slowly, deliberately, landing on one delegation and then another. "You had our warning. It was documented. It was formal. It was given in good faith because we genuinely hoped it would never be necessary. The Vreth had our warning and chose to disregard it. You had the opportunity to ensure the Vreth took it seriously. You chose, instead, to table our distress and mediate on behalf of our attackers. We are not asking for your help. We are not asking for your permission. We are asking for exactly nothing from this body." She reached into her jacket and produced a single physical document, a printed sheet, an archaic format, chosen deliberately for what it communicated about the finality of what she was doing. She placed it on the desk in front of her. "Earth is formally suspending its conclave membership, effective immediately, pending a full review of this body's obligations to member civilizations under active attack. We will notify you when we are ready to renegotiate the terms." She picked up her case. She walked out. The chamber was quiet for a long time after the door closed behind her. Rena was in her office when the Conclave's internal intelligence network began lighting up. She had been there for most of the past 3 weeks, sleeping in 4-hour rotations on the cot she'd had installed in the corner years ago, eating whatever her aide brought her without particular attention to what it was, and monitoring approximately 11 different data streams simultaneously with the focused, almost serene attention of a person doing exactly the work they were built for. What she was watching now, in the hours after Hana's exit from the conclave chamber, was something she had anticipated but had not quite been able to picture until she saw it happening in real time. The galaxy was doing research. Every conclave intelligence service, every academic institution with access to historical Earth records, every think tank and analyst division attached to a species delegation that had suddenly realized they had very little actual information about the civilization currently taking apart a major power. All of them were pulling Earth files. Historical records, archaeological data, political histories, military archives, the ones that were publicly accessible, which were extensive, because humanity had never been ashamed of its military history exactly. It had simply never occurred to them that the rest of the galaxy wasn't paying attention. Rena watched the access logs roll in. She watched which records were being pulled, and in what order, and she could track, from the pattern of the searches, the exact moment each analyst hit the part of human history that made them stop and recalculate. It was usually somewhere around the industrial period, when the scale of the conflicts became clear, when the weapons development curves appeared on the timeline, exponential, relentless, generation after generation, each one building on the last, driven not by any single empire's ambition, but by the collective, grinding, species-wide need to survive each other. That was the part that stopped people, not the scale of the violence. The Vreth had done violence at scale. What stopped them was the continuity of it. The unbroken thread running from the earliest recorded human conflicts to the present day. The way each era of destruction had fed directly into the next era's weapons. The way humanity had spent thousands of years in an arms race with itself, with no external pressure required, no existential threat from another species needed to drive the innovation. They had done it entirely on their own. And then they had reached the stars and immediately filed themselves as Tier 4 and smiled politely in the conclave chamber, and told everyone, clearly and officially, to please not provoke them. One conclave scholar's analysis began circulating in the academic channels. Rena flagged it immediately and read it in full. It was careful, measured academic writing, but the conclusion was not careful or measured. The conclusion said, We assessed their tier based on time and space. We did not assess what they were doing in the time before that. We classified the fact that they arrived late to the stars as evidence of primitiveness. We did not consider the alternative, that a species capable of this rate of military development might have taken longer to reach the stars simply because they were occupied, thoroughly, persistently, and productively occupied, with conflict at home. And then, in the final paragraph, in language unusually direct for academic writing, the warning was given. It was given on the first day. We had it on record, and we did not read it carefully enough to understand what we were being warned about. Rena read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Hannah with a single line of text. Too late, but at least someone finally read it. She pulled up a new document on her terminal. She had been thinking about writing it for 3 weeks. She had been waiting until she knew how things would end, or at least how the critical phase would end, before she committed it to the record. She titled it simply. She began to write. It would not be classified. It would not be restricted. It would be submitted openly, formally, to the Conclave Intelligence Database where any species, any diplomat, any junior analyst doing their intake reading before a first contact mission could access it without restriction. She wrote for 2 hours without stopping. When she finished, she reviewed it once, made 3 small corrections, and submitted it. Then she leaned back in her chair, looked at the ceiling of her windowless office, and thought about Sona for a while. About a 26-year-old woman who had set down a stringed instrument and opened every channel she had and kept talking until there was nothing left. About what she had bought with those last 18 seconds. Rena didn't think of herself as a sentimental person. She wasn't sure she would have described what she felt right now as sentiment exactly. It was something harder than sentiment and quieter than grief, and she suspected she would be carrying it for a long time. She picked up her cold tea. She looked at the screen. Outside, across the dark distances of space, the Ember networks were still running, patient and invisible, solving the geometry of the problem. Junho was still out there. Kangho had already begun the inspection protocols on the first Vreth military installations. The thing that humanity had started was almost finished. Almost. The Vreth Dominion's formal surrender came on a Tuesday. No one had planned it that way. Tuesdays held no particular significance in any Vreth calendar system, and the delegation that transmitted the surrender document from what remained of Vreth High Command had not checked what day it was on Earth before sending it. But it arrived on a Tuesday at 11:14 in the morning, Earth Standard Time, on a frequency that routed first to Rena's terminal, because almost everything routed to Rena's terminal first, and she noted the timestamp, confirmed the document's authenticity, forwarded it simultaneously to Admiral Junho, Secretary General Yuna, and Xenodiplomacy Officer Hana, and then sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. It had been 14 months. 14 months since Sona's broadcast. 14 months since the parliaments voted. 14 months of Ember networks running silent in the dark, of Kangho's divisions moving through conditions no one else would move through, of Junho's fleet dismantling, methodically, completely, without pause or negotiation. Every military installation the Vreth Dominion had spent 6 centuries building. 14 months. It felt to Rena both very long and very short. Long because she could feel all of it in her body, the sleepless rotations, the cold tea, the weight of every decision she had fed into the intelligence chain that became someone else's action in the dark of space. Short because, measured against the thousands of years of human history that had made this moment possible, 14 months was barely a breath. She picked up her secure line. "It came through," she said when Junho answered. A pause longer than usual. She waited it out. "Terms," he said finally. "Full reparations, return of all surviving colony personnel, complete decommissioning of Vreth military infrastructure under Earth Inspection Authority. They've accepted the framework without amendment." Another pause. "They didn't negotiate." "No," She looked at the document on her screen. I don't think they felt they had a position to negotiate from. Junho was quiet for a moment. Then, tell Kangho to begin the inspection protocols on the northern installations first. That's where the bulk of their remaining assets are concentrated. Already sent, she said. He confirms receipt. Good. A breath. Something in his voice shifted very slightly, not relief exactly, but the sound of a man who had been holding something at a particular angle for 14 months and was now, very carefully, beginning to set it down. Rena. Sorry. Go sleep. Actual sleep, not the cot. She looked at the cot in the corner of her office, at the thin pillow and the folded blanket that had seen better days. After I file the confirmation report, she said. She heard something that might, in another context, have been a quiet laugh. After he agreed and ended the call, Secretary General Yuna made the announcement at noon. She stood at the same podium where she had stood 14 months ago, in the same posture, that stillness she wore like a second uniform, and she told Earth that the war was over. She said it plainly. She listed the terms. She read from the formal surrender document the Vreth Dominion's official acknowledgement of their aggression against the Kepler colonies and their acceptance of full accountability under the terms Earth had set. She did not use the word victory. She said, "Our people are coming home, all of them who can, and we will go now to bring home the ones who cannot." The cameras stayed on her face. She did not look triumphant. She did not look relieved. She looked like someone who had done what needed to be done and was already thinking about what came next, which was the grief that had been waiting patiently behind the war for 14 months to have its proper place. She ended the broadcast. Earth did not celebrate, not in the way that word usually implies, not with crowds in the streets, not with fireworks or music broadcast from government buildings. There were gatherings, yes. People came together in the way they do when something large and heavy has finally shifted, not to cheer, but simply to be near other people, to confirm in person that it was real, that it was over, that they had come through it. In the Kepler belt, the survivors of the 3 colonies were already being processed for return. Medical teams had been waiting at the border for 6 weeks. The survivors came through in groups, some walking, some carried, all of them with the particular expression of people who have spent a long time in the dark and have not yet fully accepted the light. Kangho supervised the first inspection team personally. He walked through the remains of the Vreth Third Fleet Anchorage's secondary support facilities, the ones that hadn't been touched by the Ember strikes, the administrative and logistics infrastructure that Earth's inspectors now needed to catalog and confirm for decommissioning, and he walked through it with the same deliberate, unhurried attention he gave everything. He noted every detail. He signed every confirmation document. He did not feel what most people might expect him to feel in that moment. He had been a soldier long enough to know that the end of fighting is not the same thing as the end of the weight it leaves behind. The weight comes later, in quiet moments, in ordinary places, when nothing in particular is happening, and the mind finds its way back regardless. He thought about his soldiers, about the ones he'd taken through that debris field at the edge of Vreth space, through the approach vector that every Vreth navigator avoided, through conditions his training doctrine described as high-risk extreme, about the ones who had come out the other side and the ones who hadn't. He thought about them by name. He always thought about them by name. He finished the inspection. He filed the report. He looked out through the facility's viewport at the debris field where the anchorage had been, at the slow drift of wreckage across 40,000 kilometers of emptiness, and he let himself stand there for exactly 2 minutes before turning back to his next task. That was all he allowed himself, 2 minutes. Then he went back to work. Tiho was already retired again, by the time the surrender came through. He had submitted his decommission request for Project Ember's active deployment phase the same day the last torpedo network confirmed operational stand-down, with the same lack of ceremony with which he had done everything else. He had returned to the small research facility outside of the city, where he had spent most of his career, a cluttered, comfortable place full of models and reference texts, and the particular organized chaos of a mind that never fully stopped working. He received the news of the surrender from a former colleague, who called to congratulate him. Tiho thanked him. He said he was glad it was over, he meant it. He went back to the notebook he'd been writing in a preliminary calculations for a propulsion concept he'd been wanting to revisit for years, something he'd kept setting aside every time Ember demanded his attention. He picked up his pen. He worked through the afternoon in the quiet of his office, and he was at peace in the specific way of a person who has done the thing they were given to do and is now free to do the thing they actually love. The Ember systems were already being sealed into classified archives. Their specifications, their designs, their engineering logs, all of it locked behind clearances that most people would never hold. Not because humanity was ashamed of them, but because Tiho had built them for a specific purpose, and that purpose was finished, and there was no reason, in his estimation, to leave a loaded weapon sitting on the table. He had written one note in his personal engineering log on the day the last network stood down. It said, 31 years, built to be patient, they were. Hope we never need them again, will not pretend we won't. He signed it, closed the log, and filed it with the archives. Then he made tea and went back to the propulsion notebook. Admiral Junho came home on a Thursday. His flagship docked at Earth's orbital station to no ceremony, which was exactly what he had requested. No assembled dignitaries, no formal reception, no cameras. What he got instead was Rena, standing in the docking bay in civilian clothes for the first time he could remember seeing her in any, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else he had a name for. He took the coffee. They stood for a moment in the particular silence of 2 people who have been through something large together and don't need to fill the space with words. The conclave's been trying to reach you, she said finally. I know. Hana says they want to discuss reinstatement terms. I know that too. She also says they've reclassified Earth. There was a vote. Rena looked at her coffee. It was unanimous. Junho raised an eyebrow, not at the reclassification. He had expected something like that, at the unanimity. Tier 1, she said, reserved status. They created the category specifically. Apparently there wasn't an existing tier that felt appropriate. He was quiet for a moment. What does Hana think of the terms? She thinks they're acceptable. She said to tell you they've also quietly amended their intake questionnaire for new species. Rena allowed herself a very small, very dry expression. They added a question about prolonged internal conflict. Junho looked at her. They're calling it the human question, she said, internally. He thought about that, about the conclave's ancient chamber, and Hana standing in Earth's small outer ring seat, and the galaxy that had looked at humanity at the most persistently, productively, relentlessly conflict-forged species to ever reach the stars, and had classified them as Tier 4 because they arrived late and smiled politely. He thought about what it had cost to correct that misapprehension. He drank his coffee. Tell Hana to take the meeting, he said. And tell her to make them wait a week first. Rena made a note. Already suggested it, she said 2 weeks. Tell her she's right. The memorials were held across 3 days. Not just on Earth, on every surviving Kepler colony, on the orbital stations, on the transport ships still carrying people home. Wherever humans were gathered in enough numbers to come together, they came together, and they read names, and they were quiet. Sona's memorial was held at Deep Space Station Orion, or rather, at the location in space where Orion had been, aboard a salvage vessel that had been granted special dispensation to hold position there for the duration of the ceremony. There was no debris left to mark the spot. The Vreth had been thorough, but the coordinates existed, precisely logged in the military record, and that was enough. Hana attended that one in person, traveling the considerable distance to be there. She stood among a small group of Orion's former colleagues in Sona's family, her parents, her younger brother, who had his sister's same steady eyes, and she listened to someone read Sona's service record aloud, and she was quiet in the way she had learned to be quiet over 14 months of sitting in the conclave chamber, while the galaxy debated and her people died. Sona's father thanked her afterward for coming. Hana held his hand in both of hers and said she was sorry. She meant it in the way that goes past words, the kind of sorry that doesn't expect to be answered, that simply needs to be said. She flew back to the conclave the next morning. There was work to do. There was always work to do. She did it carrying what she carried, the same way all of them carried what they carried, Junho, Kangho, Rina, Tiho, all of them, present and functional and never quite without the weight of it. That was what it was to be human, she thought, somewhere over the dark distance between Orion's coordinates and the conclave's ancient chamber. You carried things. You kept going. You went back to work. You remembered, you kept working, that was all, that was everything. Rina's report was submitted to the Conclave Intelligence Database on a quiet afternoon 3 weeks after the surrender. She had written it in 2 hours and revised it once and then submitted it without ceremony, the same way she did everything. It was not classified. It carried no access restrictions. Any species, any diplomat, any analyst, any junior intake officer reviewing materials before a first contact mission could pull it up without clearance, without request, without anyone needing to know they'd read it. Within 1 week, it was the most accessed document in Conclave history. It was not long. Rina had never seen the point of length for its own sake. It stated clearly and without embellishment what had happened, what the warning had said, when it had been given, where it was in the record, what had been done with it, what the consequences of that decision had been, measured in destroyed installations and broken fleet assets and 14 months of a war that had not needed to happen. The final paragraph was 3 sentences. This report exists for one reason. The warning was given before the provocation. Read the warning first. She did not sign it with her rank or her division or any of the formal credentials that usually appeared on intelligence documents. She signed it with her name. Just her name. Somewhere on the far edge of explored space, a small diplomatic vessel was making its way toward the Galactic Conclave's registration station. Aboard it, a newly spacefaring species was preparing their intake materials, the forms, the declarations, the required reading that all new conclave members were expected to complete before their first formal session. The delegation was young and hopeful and slightly nervous in the way of people doing something large for the first time. One of the junior diplomats, a slight young woman whose job it was to compile the required reading into a briefing document for the delegation's senior staff, was working through the conclave's document database when she came across the most accessed file in the system's history. She opened it because the access count seemed unusual. She started reading because the first line was clear and direct in a way that most conclave documents were not. She finished it because she couldn't stop once she'd started. She sat with it for a moment. Then she closed the file, stood up, and walked to the senior diplomat's cabin. She knocked. When he opened the door, she said without preamble, "Sir, there's something you need to read before we go in." He looked at her expression. He did not ask what it was. He simply stepped back to let her in. She pulled up the file on his terminal. She pointed to the title. She pointed to the access count. She pointed to the final paragraph. He read it. He read the full report. She watched his expression change as he read, not dramatically, just a quiet, settling shift, the look of a person recalibrating something. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The humans," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes, sir." He looked at the screen for another moment. Then he turned to her. "We leave them alone," he said. She nodded. He did not ask her why she was certain. He'd read it too. He understood. She returned to her desk. Outside the viewport, the stars moved past in their slow, ancient drift, a galaxy going about its business, neither kind nor cruel, simply vast, simply continuing, the way it always had. Somewhere in it, humans were going back to work. They were building, remembering, carrying what they carried, watching, always watching from behind patient eyes. The warning was still in the record. It had always been in the record. It would remain there for anyone who wanted to read it, for as long as the record existed. Rena had made sure of that.